Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. One common thing that all modern Macs have, whether you have a base model M1 machine or a spec'd out MacBook Pro, is fantastic support for extremely performant connection standards and ports. Any Mac with Apple Silicon will have at least Thunderbolt 3 and USB 4 support, which is capable of some amazing speeds. The trade-off being that you're probably not going to have many ports available. For anyone that wants to expand their port selection with a hub or a dock and fully utilize your machine's performance, you're likely going to look at a premium dock. The problem is a lot of the gear that's out there is just disguised as premium or has premium features on the surface that tell one story, but after digging into them, show another. My goal here is to dive deep into some of the premium aspects of USB hubs or docks, things like transfer speeds, monitor support, and understanding how some of those things can be wildly different than they appear. We'll also get into what to look for in cables and why they're so important, and some of the more nice to have things that you might consider when choosing a hub. Now this is a bit of a follow-up from a video that I did a couple months back when I talked about different price categories and aspects of USB hubs like transfer rates, so you can check that out for more information beyond what's in this video. I'll link it in the description, but one thing that became abundantly clear from that video, outpouring support for the CalDigit TS4 as the best premium dock that's out there on the market. And because of that, I reached out to CalDigit and they've supplied 3 different products for this video. We're going to look at the TS4 along with 2 other options, the TS3 Plus and the CalDigit Element Hub. While I'll relate a lot of what I'm talking to about these specific products and some tips between choosing these and what makes them great, you can use this info outside of these particular hubs as well. The first thing that I want to dive into is probably one of the most misunderstood things out there when it comes to ports and really leads into everything else we'll go over. That being the difference between Thunderbolt 3, Thunderbolt 4, and USB 4. If you're looking for performance, any of these standards is usually your starting point, and it's not super clear how these are different from each other at a glance. Pretty much anywhere you look, even in Apple spec sheets, you're going to see a little up to 40 gigabits per second note attached to anything that's listed as Thunderbolt 3 or 4 or USB 4. That kind of gives the impression that these all do the same thing or run at the same speeds, but that actually isn't the case, and knowing the difference here can be important in determining what your needs are or have some influence with whatever premium hub that you're considering. The first thing to note here is the speed itself. While these are all capable of 40 gigabits per second transfer speeds, there are some differences here. USB 4 is only required to support up to 20 gigabits per second, even though it is capable of 40. You'll often find a lower transfer speed designation on the label, but in any case, it is less regulated and doesn't require certification in the same way that Thunderbolt does. The Thunderbolt requires specific metrics that it has to reach outlined by Intel to be given a Thunderbolt 3 or 4 designation, both of which must have transfer speeds at a minimum of 40 gigabits per second. The one difference between Thunderbolt 3 and 4 is that Thunderbolt 4 does have a higher minimum data transfer rate of 32 gigabits per second, where Thunderbolt 3 is only 16. So while they both have a minimum transfer rate of 40 over the entire connection, there is a bit of a difference as it relates specifically to data transfer for things like storage devices. That being said, most Macs with Thunderbolt 3 ports support higher speeds than those minimum data requirements. Some of the very first Macs that had Thunderbolt 3 did have lower rates on the right side of the machine for some reason, but outside of that, the difference that you're going to see between the TS3 Plus and the TS4, the Element Hub in terms of Thunderbolt speed, probably won't be very noticeable, but they do offer quite a difference in port selection. The TS3 Plus has 2 Thunderbolt ports, one you're going to plug into your computer, which leaves you with 1 active Thunderbolt 3 port. Outside of that, there is 5 USB-A ports with 5 gigabit per second transfer speeds, 1 USB-C port that does 5 gigabits, and 1 that does 10, so just in terms of ports available with varying speeds, there's a lot there. The Element Hub is definitely a step up when it comes to higher transfer rates on all the ports, as it does have 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports and 4 USB-A ports capable of 10 gigabits per second, but it is limited to USB ports, where the TS3 Plus has quite a few other features. The TS4 is kind of a hybrid of those 2 models that I just mentioned, where you've got 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 5 USB-A and 3 USB-C ports, all capable of 10 gigabits per second transfer speeds. Really outstanding on all the ports. Now, just strictly related to transfer speeds in this context, your average person, realistically, probably not going to need more than 1 Thunderbolt port available. Oftentimes that will be connecting to things like external SSDs or a high-speed networking device, something like that. And if that's all you're worried about, the TS3 Plus functionality as it's related to Thunderbolt will do you just fine. With that being said, the deciding factor for a lot of folks between Thunderbolt 3 and 4 won't actually be related to data transfer at all, but for external monitor support. Because we can run monitors from USB-C, it really adds to what we can do with something like the Element Hub, but external monitor support when it comes to premium hubs can be confusing and often misunderstood, and there's a few things that we really need to look out for. With Thunderbolt 3, it's only required to support a single 4K monitor at 60 Hz. The nice thing about the TS3 Plus is that it does have that bump to 5K at 60 Hz, so full support for things like the Apple Studio display is something you'll want to be aware of if you do have one of those monitors. And it's also got DisplayPort available, so you don't have to spend that Thunderbolt port on something like a 4K monitor if you don't want to. But that port will support a single external monitor nonetheless. Thunderbolt 4, on the other hand, is required to support dual 4K monitors at 60 Hz or a single 8K monitor, which is exactly what the TS4 and Element Hubs do. You also have DisplayPort available on the TS4, the difference being that this has DisplayPort 1.4, which is just a slight bump up from version 1.2 that's on the TS3 Plus. That just means that the TS4 DisplayPort can support things like 8K resolution, where the TS3 Plus port can't. You might have noticed that with MacBooks that contain the base M1 or M2 processors, like the MacBook Air or the 13-inch Pro, they will only support a single external monitor, hence the Thunderbolt 3 designation. But when you move into the 14 or 16-inch Pro models, they will support dual monitors as they fully support Thunderbolt 4. Now, I know this isn't an ideal limitation for some people, and you will see hubs out there that advertise something called DisplayLink. That's not to be confused with DisplayPort, which is completely unrelated, but DisplayLink gets around that single monitor limitation and is running multiple monitors on an M1 or an M2 machine. But it's really important to understand how DisplayLink actually works because there are some pretty big gotchas that come along with it. So part of the problem with this whole single dual monitor thing is the amount of bandwidth it takes to run a display. A single 4K monitor can take anywhere from 9 to 18 gigabits per second to effectively run at 60 Hz. So we're really brushing up against the limit for what we can do there. DisplayLink gets around that by first installing software on your machine that communicates with the DisplayLink enabled hardware. When you plug in a monitor into that hardware, it detects it and presents it to macOS. The operating system will then send the display data it has to the DisplayLink software, where it gets compressed and sent to the DisplayLink hardware and then to your monitor. Because it is compressed, it takes a lot less bandwidth and therefore has a lot more potential in terms of driving more displays with less data transfer. And while that sounds good in theory, it does have its downsides. Your picture can look a little bit fuzzy or distorted, and there will be some added latency as well, just due to that whole compression process running in the background. And while it may not be as noticeable in static apps, anything like gaming or doing anything that requires a lot of real-time feedback, it's probably going to struggle or not be ideal. Not only that, but if you're like me and you like to unlock your machine with your Apple Watch, that's probably not going to work, and you can also run into issues with apps that are protected with something called high bandwidth copy protection. Apps like Netflix and Apple TV use this to prevent people pirating their content, and because DisplayLink works similarly to screen recorders and video capture devices, it can trigger those protection flags, and there have definitely been some issues with playback and streaming apps like these. On top of that, things like system updates can break your DisplayLink setup, so while it may seem to work for some folks, there's just a lot of variables that come into play, and really when you start looking at the prices of a lot of this gear, you start looking between $170 and $400 at times for what's overall a lot worse hub than the CalDigit ones that I have here. Often you'll find that outside of focusing in on multiple display ports, the specs on most of these hubs are going to be pretty underwhelming. Most of them are going to support run-of-the-mill USB 3.0 speeds, and anything like SD card readers or other ports are usually not great, and I find them to be quite overpriced. Comparatively, the Element Hub is $249 and has so much more potential than any of these DisplayLink hubs do, and in general is just so much better quality, usually for around the same price. I reached out to CalDigit and asked them why they never considered making a DisplayLink hub, and they echoed a lot of this and added that most people who own Macs want something that just works.
It just worked.
It just works
the way it ought to.
They just work.
Really works, and it really works.
Seems like that story might check out. I do occasionally get messages from folks on the channel saying that their screens are blurry, saying it is their hub or their cables. And my hunch is that they are either running something like DisplayLink or they're using a cable that just doesn't support enough bandwidth to run at native resolution, and it's actually running at something lower, making it appear blurry. All the cables that we use in modern displays are digital, so a cable in itself, whether it's a $5 cable or a $30 cable, so long as it supports the same bandwidth, are all going to look the same. And I do think that there is some confusion there. USB-C cables in particular, and HDMI and DisplayPort to a lesser extent, are kind of a disaster to understand at times. I do think it's a bit funny that we think of this as a universal cable that works between all devices, because depending on what you're doing, a lot of these can be incompatible or inefficient. Like, without me telling you, it would be impossible to know that this cable is only good for 480 megabits per second, this one's good for 10 gigabits, and this one's good for 40. If I try and plug in a monitor with a cable that restricts power or bandwidth, it's either not going to work or it'll work at a reduced resolution. And similarly, if I want to use that cable for things like data transfer or power delivery, I'm gonna get the same result. So if you're buying cables, it's just really important to know what speed or standard they're rated for. I usually just try and avoid any issues and grab cables with really high standards because they're all backwards compatible. And then you don't have to worry about potential issues, and because Thunderbolt cables specifically have higher standards that they have to meet, they're usually a bit better quality as well. And I know these hubs don't use HDMI, but the same goes for those two. You'll want to make sure that your cables are above HDMI 2.0 in most cases, or HDMI 2.1 for really high refresh rates like 120 Hz at 4K, and higher resolutions like 8K. Beyond those things being the primary factors when considering premium hubs, you'll also want to look at other peripherals or connectors that they have available. Obviously, the Element hub here is more of a no-nonsense hub that is just strictly USB ports and USB-C ports with the added benefits of Thunderbolt 4. It's also much smaller than the TS4 or the TS3 Plus, which is something that you want to consider. But the TS3 Plus and the TS4 have a lot more ports and functionality. I've mentioned this before in other videos, but both the TS3 Plus and TS4 have UHS-2 SD card readers, and the TS4 also has a UHS-2 micro SD card reader, which is pretty neat and something that I haven't really seen that often. But for me, it's pretty much a must to have that speed when working with large video files so often, so it's definitely something that I require. Also, both of these have audio in and out, but they do differ a little bit there. The TS3 Plus does have an optical audio port where the TS4 does not, and on the front of the TS3 Plus you have both audio in and out 3.5mm jacks. The TS4 does have those jacks as well, they're just on the back. And then on the front you've got a single 3.5mm jack where you can plug in a 3-ring connector for devices that have both mic input and speakers like headsets, which is super handy for things like taking calls. Both have Ethernet ports as well. The TS3 Plus is a pretty standard gigabit connection where the TS4 gets bumped up to 2.5 gigabits. So that's perfect if you have an internet connection that sits above gigabit speeds that you want to connect to, or if you're going to connect to network access storage or something like that. Each of these 3 hubs is great for different use cases. If you want to go with a full-on future-proof solution and you're not worried about SD card readers or external audio or any of that kind of thing, the Element hub is an amazing little hub. It's not often that you find something with 4 USB 4 ports and 4 USB A ports capable of 10 gigabits, especially at around $250. If you are willing to spend a little bit more, the TS3 Plus will cost you around $299, and the TS4 you're looking at about $399. With the TS3 Plus, you do only have 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, but for a lot of people that's all they're gonna need. And then you still get some really great features like UHS-2 card support, audio and network ports, and plenty of USB options. I can see people with the base M1 or M2 choosing this quite often. But if you want to go above and beyond that, the TS4 is really the cream of the crop and offers the most here. And I know that a lot of you out there have either recommended this hub or want it, and I have to say that it totally lives up to the hype as one of, if not the best USB dock out there on the market. One thing is for sure, I think that all these CalDigit products are great quality. They all have metal housings, they all feel like they're built really well. They're not plasticky or anything like that like you get with a lot of hubs. And they're one of the only hubs that I've had where I haven't had to sacrifice anything in terms of maybe a device not connecting or showing up, or a monitor not waking up, any of those intermittent annoyances that you'll usually find. And they are one of the only hub brands that are sold on the Apple Store. And we all know Apple isn't going to sell junk, especially when it comes to third-party stuff. The quality is definitely something that you have to look out for in products like these, especially given all that we've went over in this video. As I said earlier, I did make a video previous to this one talking about USB hubs at different price points that sit below these. So if these hubs aren't doing it for you, or some of this info maybe doesn't make sense, you can check that out. I will link it in the description below, along with all these CalDigit products if they did interest you. And if you have any questions about these hubs at all, or have any thoughts on hub specs, whatever it is, drop a comment down below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button if you want to see more tech-related content, or if you want to study and bring back phrases from 90s beer commercials, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.